And welcome to the Gay Liberation Network here on Chicago Access Network Television. I'm Andy Thayer with the Gay Liberation Network. And with me tonight is Asha Rosa of Black Youth Project 100, BYP 100, which has really been one of the most dynamic organizations that has been involved in the whole post-Ferguson protest. BYP 100, as you'll see in some of the pictures coming up that we'll get on your screen in a little bit from now, they were right out there right from the get-go in response to Ferguson. And of course, we've had many Fergusons right around the country, which I'm sure Asha will say a few things about, including right here in Chicago. But to start out the conversation, Asha, could you tell people what Black Youth 100 Project is about, the sort of work that you do?
Yeah, so the Black Youth Project 100 is an activist, member-based organization of Black 18 to 35-year-olds. We formed around the time, or at the time, of the verdict, the George Zimmerman verdict after the Trayvon Martin case. And so our organizing came out of that. And so between, Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, the organization has been working to end criminalization, working on various aspects of issues of Black liberation and Black freedom, and kind of laying that groundwork that has led up to the moment that we're now in.
Well, it's a little bit ironic because also our organization, the Gay Liberation Network, we started in 1998 in response to Matthew Shepard's murder in Wyoming. He was the gay college student, and one of the operating theses of our organization is that we LGBT people need to lead the LGBT struggle, but we definitely need solidarity from people who are not LGBT, and we were greatly helped in that. And while we didn't get any substantive legislative changes after Matthew Shepard's murder, it was the consciousness that was raised through those series of demonstrations that went a long way to paving the way to where we are today, where we finally have won most aspects of legal equality, at least here in Illinois. And so when we see what happens with Michael Brown, when we see what happens with Eric Garner in New York, we see what happens with so many cases right here in Chicago, it's incumbent upon, I believe, LGBT people, regardless of race, to be in solidarity with others who are facing whether state repression or racism from other angles as well. And so we were very excited when Black Youth Project 100 took the initiatives that you did in terms of immediately responding. And as we'll see, as I said, there's been actions, it seems, at least every week and sometimes daily. And Black Youth Project 100 has been in the midst of those. Could you tell people, Asha, what are the sort of reforms that your organization would like to see?
Yeah, so Black Youth Project 100 published a couple months back something called the Agenda to Keep Us Safe. And in that are a variety of policy suggestions that we think are positive, are good, and that we stand behind, that speak to the ending of criminalization of young folks of color. So in that is decriminalization of marijuana, where we see in a city like Chicago, misdemeanor marijuana possession is the leading category of arrest. So we see the cops, saying that this institution of policing is here to keep us safe. But when we actually look at the numbers of what they spend their time arresting people for, it's things like petty drug possession. And that, for us, isn't something that's keeping anybody safe. It's just giving young kids records and making it harder for them to get a job, get education, get any type of federal aid.
Yeah. And there's been a racial angle to that, too. I mean, even the Chicago Tribune has pointed out that if you're white, you're much less likely to spend the night in the police station. If you're Black or Latino, you're going to spend that night. If you're white, you're going to be getting just a ticket and have to show up at a kangaroo court where you get found guilty, but at least you don't spend your night in the hokey.
Right, and so the basis on that is kind of dispelling this notion of, right, like crime is constructed. Like the police could spend time in any neighborhood in the city and would probably arrest the same amount of people for having misdemeanor marijuana possession.
Right.
There are studies that show that that's true. However, they're spending their time on the south and west sides. In the Austin neighborhood on the west side of Chicago, predominantly working class black neighborhood, is where we see the most arrests for this misdemeanor. So that's one thing. We also are asking for demilitarization of police, and then also an investment in community alternatives to policing, things that, work with a transformative justice framework. So looking at when there are problems in communities, how can we be looking at the roots of those problems to support communities in the places where they need them for those communities to thrive and for those problems to be solved, and not just punishing people for when they mess up, but not supporting communities to help them solve problems. And so with that also, police accountability is something that we're really big on. Folks in Chicago have been organizing to get a civilian elected police review board. Now we have one body called the Independent Police Review Authority, but it's essentially a part of the police department. Many of the complaints that go to IPRA are then funneled back into the police department, and they basically have their discretion for how they run. So we want more community oversight over the police that can check them, and ultimately are supportive of reforms that take power away from the police and give it back to communities that ultimately know what community safety is and looks like best for them.
Well, we've got a caller or two here. We'll try and take as many of these as we reasonably can. Caller, you're on Candy.
Good evening. A couple things
Yes.
you mentioned about the police review board. Also, something else has to be done is when it comes to their funding, you got to have the funding not coming from the Chicago Police Department, so it make them totally independent. The other thing needs to be done when a shooting involves a civilian, they need to have a independent prosecutor as well, and take certain things away from it. I've been saying for the last 5 years, we do need to have those body cams on the police officers, and just watch. It's going to change a lot of things in terms of policing. And one of the problems in terms of police, I'll be real quick, one of the problems in terms of policing on the south and west side, police officers, they get promoted on base of guns and drugs. And that's the other problem as well. And when you live in a community where the money don't stay in the community no longer than 4 hours compared to other communities, at least 7 days, that's a problem. That's really the source of a lot of the crime.
Okay, thank you, sir. I mean, one thing that I would say is that, unfortunately, a body cam would have helped Eric Garner in New York. It was all on film there. With Rodney King, again, it was all on film. In fact, the only reason why we got rid of the notorious John Burge, the police torturer who ran a torture ring in a few of the different police stations, headquarters around the city, Area 2 being the most notorious, was he was fired literally a week after the Rodney King rebellion. And clearly the authorities, this is a little bit before your time, Asha, but we had been working in GLN as well as many other organizations to get John Burge fired and criminally prosecuted for many, many years. But it was only thanks to the protests around Rodney King's situation that we finally got rid of John Burge, but he still was only criminally prosecuted for perjury. So I think that it's sort of a one step forward, 2 steps back. Asha, I know that Black Youth 100 project has got some stance on body cams and other funding for police. What is that, please?
Yeah, and just to speak to the point that you're saying, I think especially with the John Burge cases and connecting this idea that, the police are connected, an analysis around the police needs to be connected to an economic justice analysis. And folks in Chicago are now organizing for reparations for the folks who were tortured by John Burge, and so looking at reparations like things that are long-lasting, things that will support communities like education, mental health services, as well as financial compensation for folks that spent long periods of their lives in jail. But
I think your point, though, caller, about the whole issue of State's Attorney Anita Alvarez and her failure to prosecute cops who are, the evidence would appear to at least justify an indictment, if not vigorous prosecution. She's been missing in action, as have all of her predecessors. And so the idea of having some sort of independent body, someone who is not reliant on the police department to make all their other cases, would be a step in the right direction, don't you think?
Definitely. That's very important, I think. And then, with body cameras, I think, I can understand why we want more transparency around, access to seeing what the police are doing on a day-to-day basis. But ultimately, body cameras are putting more money toward a broken system of policing. And it really gives the police control over kind of what that looks like. So I think if they happen, and if this is BYP 100 stance, there needs to be community oversight. There needs to be transparency clauses so they can't, withhold tapes or alter them in any way. But ultimately, we have these cases, especially the Eric Garner case, which is just this is most kind of clear-cut case, and we had a non-indictment in Staten Island. And that it just kind of reinforces that we can have this stuff on tape, and it's not necessarily going to hold cops accountable, because it's just cops are never prosecuted. In Chicago, I think it's less than 2%. A report by We Charge Genocide showed that less than 2% of the 10,000 of cops that have 10 or more serious complaints against. So these are cops that have either shot people or beaten them badly, and people reported it, and we know most of the cases probably aren't reported. Out of those cops, less than 2% of them get any penalty, and those penalties include like a 1-day suspension. So folks are not even being asked to take a day off work to think about serious stuff. So there's really no system of accountability, even when we have this stuff on tape.
So before we get more callers on here, I'd like to bring some announcements to people's attention. Get it up here. Bear with us. And of course, there we go. Is part of the struggle for justice, not just here in the United States, but around the world. There's going to be a protest on next Thursday, Guantanamo, 13 years later, protesting the years and years of indefinite detention without charges for most people, not to mention the torture of force feeding and so forth that's been happening at Guantanamo. People may remember, of course, that President Obama's first promise upon getting into office was to close down Guantanamo, and here we are in the waning years of his second administration, and Guantanamo is still open. The United States is part of this international so-called war on terror, which keeps on bringing blowback when the United States thinks it can just endlessly lob drones at other countries, and then picks up people without charges and brings them to places like Guantanamo. So please check out that protest next Thursday, 4:30 p.m. In front of the Art Institute on Michigan Avenue. And this next event here, this is something that Black Youth 100 Project has been really involved with. And Asha, if you could tell people about what's coming up a little bit later that day, next Thursday, at 1000 West Roosevelt.
Right, so there's going to be a Reclaim MLK Day action. It's not Black Youth Project 100, but some of our allies are organizing a rally kind of trying to reclaim the narrative around Martin Luther King that we normally hear on MLK Day, which is usually one that kind of assumes that that struggle is over and we're remembering something from history and not about present-day struggles. And this action was actually in part planned by some 4th through 8th graders from the Village Leadership Academy. So really, it's been an intergenerational effort of kids leading that.
Yeah, and finally, in order to get in touch with Black Youth 100 Project, there's their website right there at the top of the screen as well, some information about your Twitter feed, how you can get involved with Black Youth 100 Project. There's our logo coming up right there to get involved with Asha's organization and continue the fight for justice here in Chicago. We in the Gay Liberation Network certainly encourage folks to get involved with Black Youth Project 100. So, Asha, I'd like to shift gears for a little bit before we take more calls and talk about our upcoming mayoral election. We've seen Rahm Emanuel, after frankly screwing the 99% for most of his term, decided to move to the left and talk about things like minimum wage, talk about things like low-income housing. Some of us feel it's all talk. What verbiage, if any, have you heard out of the Emanuel administration regarding Chicago police misconduct and how to prevent more Fergusons here in Chicago?
Yeah, I mean, just to speak to all of the mayoral candidates, I think I haven't seen anyone with a good stance or platform around community safety, and what I have seen really seems like too little too late, or just kind of misguided solutions. You know, we have Rahm Emanuel patting himself on the back for saying he's strengthened our police force, and then we have some of our quote-unquote progressive candidates talking about putting more police on the streets and talking about this idea of there being better police. And really, I think at this point we need to be talking about solutions that take power away from a very, very broken, or, you know, I believe fundamentally flawed system of policing, and putting that power, putting that funding in other places. Like 39% of the city of Chicago's operational budget is going toward police, and that's coming out of Mayor Emanuel's reign of systematically defunding public education in black neighborhoods.
Mental health clinics.
Right, mental health clinics, and putting in more police. And so when you see that, the defunding of resources that communities need, what I see is a divestment from opportunities for certain people and an investment in controlling and incarcerating those same populations. So I really think that point about putting more police on the streets, the police are, you know, being a police officer is a job. You're evaluated based on a quota, and that means there's going to be more police means more arrests. And when the cops are spending their days arresting folks for misdemeanors, we really have to be asking this question, and I think it's moving more toward the mainstream, but I think it really needs to be a broader conversation about, does police equal community safety? And my answer is no.
Well, and I think we've seen that statistically here in the city of Chicago. While Chicago is not, quote-unquote, the murder capital of the nation, we do have a lot more murders, definitely on a per capita basis, but even on an absolute basis. We have far more murders than New York City, that with a their population's 3 times as large as Chicago's. And we have more murders than Los Angeles, a population 1 million more than Chicago's, and yet we have far more cops per capita here in Chicago than any other major city in the country, except for Washington and Baltimore. According to the FBI statistics for 2012, for every community, 50,000 people or more, Chicago is number 3 in the nation in per capita cops versus civilians. And they counted all law enforcement officers in that statistic, which included federal cops and various state agencies and so forth. So given the federal government's presence in D.C. and also secondarily in Baltimore, arguably right here in Chicago, we've got more cops per capita than any other city in the United States, over 50,000 people, and yet we've got a violence problem, not just among civilians, but from police, which is rightfully notorious around the country and around the world. So clearly, more cops, and we've got Emanuel, before he got into office, saying he'd have 1,000 more. You had Fioretti call for 500 more, and then recently Chuy Garcia one-upped him by saying, oh, I'm going to have 1,000. Without asking the question, is this going to make us safer?
Is this going to make us safer? Yeah, and you know, there have been studies, all kinds of studies around community safety, right? The studies have shown that if you give young people in a particular neighborhood jobs, if you give them jobs, violence goes down.
Right.
If you give them good educational opportunities, violence goes down. And there have really not been any conclusive studies saying the same thing about putting more police in neighborhoods. More police does not mean less violence. It means putting more police on the streets means more crime, because there's more people out there looking for it. It means more folks getting arrested, and more folks being funneled into this system that leaves them hard pressed to get a job, without hardly any opportunities for federal aid. And really, for the most part, it's for nonviolent offenses.
Let's try and squeeze in a call or two here before we have to wrap up. Go ahead, caller. You're on CAN TV. What's your question or comment, please?
Yes, hi. How you doing?
Just fine, thank you.
Yes. My comment I wanted to say was that the police. You guys are talking about the police, and I hear you saying the police brutality, and I agree with you.
Okay. Well, thank you. We can take another quick call here, perhaps. No? Okay. Well, we don't have much time here left, Asha. We've got this major event coming up next Thursday, actually 2 events on Thursday. I know that there's also going to be a march on MLK Day itself the following Monday. What are the next steps for the Black Youth Project 100? Where do you see, what direction should we be going in?
Yeah, and so I spoke a little bit to what our agenda to keep us safe looks like. We're continuing to organize around that. Here in Chicago, we have a campaign specifically asking for decriminalization of marijuana and using that as a platform to be talking about racial profiling and demanding that the ordinance that now says the cops have discretion on whether or not it's an arrestable offense, but obviously they're still arresting tons and tons of 44 black people a day, I think it is, for these misdemeanor marijuana offenses. So we're trying to take we're trying to make that a non-arrestable offense. That's what we're working on here in Chicago. So definitely look out for that campaign. We're trying to make this a topic that in this aldermanic race is being talked about, and it has been. Yeah, and moving forward, we also have signed on to some national demands with the Ferguson Action Network. So with that, we're asking for investigations of police departments across the country for racial bias. Also, the End Racial Profiling Act federally, and continuing this conversation of how can we pass legislation that repurposes funds from the police and from building new prisons, and for that to go toward community alternatives to policing. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting moment that has around this Ferguson solidarity stuff since Mike Brown, where we've seen a lot of folks be politicized, and we've kind of seen the movement go from asking for the indictment of specific police officers and move toward a broader structural analysis that is demanding economic and social justice as that's tied to an end to criminalization. And so we're trying to broaden that, shift the conversation from one about just interpersonal violence toward how structural violence is working as well.
And I think that's really been the biggest gain is we've had, while we haven't seen anything legislatively to write home about, that there has been a genuine change in consciousness amongst many thousands, millions of people here in the country, even though it has not been reflected perhaps in our legislators and so forth. We're going to have to be wrapping up here with a few quick announcements here. First of all, just some pictures of some of the protests here that we've seen, and we're going to have to be skipping through this because we're running out of time here. Asha, we've just got like 30 seconds more to go here. One final comment here before we go off the air. What do you want people to do, our viewers here? What do you want them to do? What should they do?
Yeah, I think get involved. If that means going out to a protest, go out to a protest. If there's an organization that shares your values, join it. If there's not, start one. But just, encouraging folks to be thinking about our positions in the world as political, and engaging in that.
Okay, and this has been Andy Thayer with Asha Rosa. Thank you so much for watching tonight. We appreciate your comments, those of you who were able to call in, and you all have a pleasant evening. Be out at the protests in the streets of Chicago. Thanks again.